They called it the party of the decade, but it ended as the scandal of the century. Thomas Bailey, a man who had everything, money, power, and a brand new girlfriend young enough to be his daughter, decided to rent out the entire
A
ballroom of the
toast to a
Plaza
wonderful
Hotel
evening.
in New York
Indeed,
City
cheers to that.
just to
Let's keep it
celebrate
professional.
divorcing his wife of 20 years. He thought he had won. He thought the prenup was ironclad. He stood on that stage, champagne in hand, laughing at the woman who built him. But he didn't check the guest list closely enough, because sitting quietly in the back wasn't just a guest. It was his wife's lawyer. And when that old man stood up, the music didn't just stop. Thomas Bailey's entire life did. This is the story of how the most arrogant man in Manhattan celebrated his divorce right up until he lost it all. The invitations were printed on heavy cream-colored cardstock with gold leaf edges weighing nearly half a pound each. They didn't say divorce party; that would have been too crude even for Thomas Bailey. Instead, the calligraphy read, "A celebration of new beginnings." But everyone in New York's upper crust knew exactly what it was. It was a victory lap. Thomas Bailey, CEO of Bailey Logistics, was worth an estimated $380 million. He was a man who wore custom Brooks Brothers suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent and treated people like disposable coffee cups. For 22 years he had been married to Margaret. Margaret was the quiet one, the one who smoothed over his jagged edges at dinner parties, the one who raised their 2 sons while Thomas was away on business in Chicago or Los Angeles, and the one who had stood by him when the SEC came sniffing around in 2018. But Margaret had aged. She was 48 now, with smile lines she refused to erase and silver streaks in her brown hair she wouldn't dye. Thomas, on the other hand, had simply traded up. Her name was Ashley Vaughn. She was 26, an influencer with a hazy job description and a very clear ambition. She was the reason for the party. She was the new beginning. 3 months earlier, on a humid August evening, the first crack had appeared in Margaret Miller's carefully constructed world. She stood at the kitchen sink of their modest 2-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn, washing dishes from dinner, her hands moving through soapy water in a rhythm perfected over decades. The apartment wasn't much IKEA furniture they'd bought when Daniel was born: family photos and drugstore frames lining the walls, a refrigerator covered in Eric's report cards and soccer schedules. It was a far cry from the penthouse Thomas kept in Manhattan, the one he claimed he needed for late nights at the office. Margaret wore an old Columbia hoodie Daniel had outgrown and yoga pants with a hole in the left knee. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, strands escaping to frame a face that looked tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. She was 48 years old and felt every single year of it. The front door opened. Thomas walked in carrying a manila envelope, his $5,000 watch catching the overhead light. He didn't greet her. He simply walked to the kitchen counter, set down the envelope with the careful precision of someone placing a bomb, and scrolled through his phone. Margaret turned off the faucet. 20 years of marriage had taught her to read silences. "We need to talk." Thomas's voice was flat, rehearsed. He still didn't look at her. She dried her hands on a dish towel, the terry cloth rough against her palms. Her wedding ring caught on a loose thread. She'd been meaning to get it resized. She'd lost weight over the past year, stress eating away at her in reverse, but there never seemed to be time. Thomas slid the envelope across the marble countertop. The sound of paper on stone seemed too loud in the small kitchen. "Divorce papers. My lawyer drew them up." The words hung in the air like smoke. Margaret's hands went still on the towel. She didn't reach for the envelope. She didn't cry. She just stood there, the fluorescent light humming overhead, the faucet dripping into the sink with a steady rhythm that suddenly felt like a countdown. "I've met someone who matches my energy." Thomas finally looked up from his phone, but his eyes landed somewhere around her shoulder, not quite meeting hers. "You've been great, really. But we've grown apart. I need someone who makes me feel alive." The memory hit her like a physical blow. 1998, 26 years old, 8 months pregnant with Daniel, sitting at a desk in Thomas's startup office at 3 in the morning. The screen in front of her glowed with lines of code, the logistics tracking system she'd been building from scratch while Thomas slept on the couch behind her. Her back ached. Her ankles were swollen. But she typed anyway because Thomas had looked at her with those earnest eyes and said the code was going to make them rich. Make them. Not him. Them. She'd been a junior programmer then, pulling down $60,000 a year, which felt like a fortune after growing up in Pittsburgh, where her father cleaned office buildings and her mother served lunch to middle schoolers. Thomas was the charismatic founder with big ideas and no technical skills. She was the one who turned those ideas into something real. "You're 48, Margaret." Thomas's voice pulled her back to the present. "You've aged. I need someone who's vibrant. Ashley is young. She's energetic. You're just beige." Beige. The word landed like a slap. Margaret looked down at her hoodie, her worn yoga pants, her bare feet on the cold linoleum. When had she become beige, or had she always been? And Thomas was only now admitting he'd noticed. "I see." Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. Inside something was cracking, but the surface held. Thomas seemed to take her calm as agreement. He relaxed slightly, leaning against the counter. "I've had my lawyer draft terms based on the prenup. You'll get $5,000 a month, the Honda. That's generous considering." $5,000 a month. Margaret did the math automatically, the way she used to calculate server loads and processing speeds. $5,000 wouldn't cover rent in most of Manhattan. It barely covered rent in the cheaper parts of Brooklyn. After 20 years, after building his entire technical infrastructure, after raising his children and managing his household, and being his unpaid therapist and public relations manager, she was worth $5,000 a month. The prenup. She finally looked at the envelope. "The one I signed when I was 28 and stupid in love. The one that protects both our interests." Thomas pulled a checkbook from his jacket pocket with a flourish. He wrote quickly, tore off the check, and set it on top of the envelope. "And here, $10,000. Goodwill gesture. First and last month on a new place, maybe some furniture. I'm not a monster, Margaret. I want you to be okay." $10,000. For 20 years. For the code she'd written. For the clients she'd charmed at dinner parties when Thomas drank too much and said offensive things. For the scandal she'd buried when his first affair came to light and she'd been stupid enough to forgive him. For the childhood she'd sacrificed raising his sons while he built an empire on her foundation. Margaret picked up the check. The paper felt thin between her fingers, insubstantial. $10,000. She looked at it for a long moment, and then with slow deliberation she tore it in half. Then in half again. The pieces fluttered to the counter like confetti. Thomas's face went red. "Are you insane? That's $10,000. If 20 years is only worth $10,000 to you, I don't need it." Her voice was still quiet, but something in it made Thomas step back. "Don't be stupid, Margaret. This is the best deal you're going to get. I have the top lawyers in New York. You contest this, I will drag you through court until you can't afford a cup of coffee. I will make your life hell. Just sign the papers, and let's end this with some dignity." Dignity. The word almost made her laugh. There was nothing dignified about being discarded like an outdated piece of software. Nothing dignified about being replaced by a 26-year-old whose primary job qualification seemed to be looking good in a bikini on Instagram. But Margaret had learned something in 20 years of marriage to a narcissist. She'd learned that silence could be a weapon, that sometimes the best response was no response at all. "I'll need 3 months." She spoke carefully, each word chosen with precision. 3 months to move out and get settled, and I'll handle the announcement my way." Thomas blinked, clearly surprised. He'd expected tears, begging, maybe even anger. This calm negotiation seemed to unsettle him more than any emotional outburst could have. 3 months. Fine. But I'm keeping the penthouse. That's non-negotiable." Of course. Margaret already knew she'd never wanted the penthouse anyway. It had always been his, decorated in his taste, filled with his things. She'd been a guest there, never quite comfortable on the leather furniture that cost more than her father had made in a year. Thomas grabbed his phone and keys. "I'll send you the name of my lawyer. Get yourself representation if you want, but it won't change the outcome. The prenup is airtight." He headed for the door, then paused. "I'm not trying to hurt you, Margaret. I deserve to be happy." The door closed behind him with a soft click that felt far more final than a slam would have. Margaret stood in the kitchen for a long time after he left the torn check pieces still scattered on the counter, the manila envelope unopened. The refrigerator hummed. The faucet dripped. Outside, sirens wailed down Atlantic Avenue. Life continued indifferent to the fact that hers had just imploded. She walked to the small desk in the corner of the living room, the one she'd bought at a yard sale 15 years ago. Her laptop sat there, closed, patient. She opened it and waited for the screen to glow to life. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for just a moment before she opened the folder she'd labeled Bailey_archive_personal. 20 years of files stared back at her. Every version of the code she'd written, every email, every document. She'd kept them all organized by year, backed up religiously because that was what good programmers did. They documented, they preserved. They built systems that lasted. And buried in that code in the very first version of BaileyLogistics.core tracking system that she'd written while 8 months pregnant in 1998 was a feature she'd almost forgotten about. An audit trail. A shadow database that recorded every transaction twice, once in the visible system Thomas and his team used every day and once in a hidden backup that only she could access. She'd built it as a safeguard the way any good engineer builds redundancy into critical systems. She'd never imagined she'd need it like this. Margaret clicked through folders, her fingers moving with muscle memory across the keyboard. Data bloomed across her screen. 20 years of it. Every shipping manifest, every financial transaction, every email sent through the company system. And there, buried in the numbers, patterns began to emerge. Money moving in ways it shouldn't. Transactions that didn't quite add up. Offshore accounts she'd never heard Thomas mention. Her hand shook as she reached for her phone. She scrolled through her contacts until she found a name she hadn't called in 5 years, Victor Hayes, attorney at law. She hit dial. The phone rang 3 times before a gravelly voice answered. "Hayes?" "Mr. Hayes, this is Margaret Miller, Robert Miller's daughter." There was a pause, then warmth flooded into the lawyer's voice. "Maggie, my God, how long has it been?" 5 years, since Dad's funeral. "I think about Bob every day." Victor's voice grew soft. "Best man I ever knew. How are you holding up?" Margaret looked at the torn check on her kitchen counter, at the divorce papers she still hadn't opened, at the screen full of data that told a story Thomas thought no one would ever read. "I need your help. Name it. It's time to collect on a promise." Victor Hayes's office was in a building that had seen better decades. The elevator creaked. The hallway carpet was worn thin in spots, and the frosted glass door had his name stenciled in gold paint that was flaking at the edges. It was the kind of place Thomas would have sneered at, which was exactly why Margaret trusted it. She knocked. A voice called for her to enter. Victor stood when she walked in, and for a moment Margaret saw him as he'd been 20 years ago, tall, commanding, fierce in a courtroom. Now he was 67, his hair fully silver, his face lined with the kind of wrinkles that came from a lifetime of careful thought, but his eyes were sharp as ever behind his tortoiseshell glasses. "Maggie." He came around the desk and pulled her into a hug that smelled like Old Spice and coffee. "You look tired." "I am tired." She sank into the leather chair across from his desk. The office was cluttered with legal books, case files stacked in precarious towers, and framed photographs of Victor's late wife. No fancy modern furniture here. No pretension. Just decades of honest work. "Tell me what's happening." So she did. She told him about Thomas's manila envelope, about the $10,000 check, about Ashley Vaughn, and the feeling of being traded in like an outdated model. Her voice stayed steady through most of it, but when she got to the part about Thomas calling her beige, something in her broke. "I built him." The words came out choked. "I wrote every line of code that made Bailey Logistics work. I debugged overnight when I was pregnant. I designed the interface our clients loved. I was the one who made it intuitive, who made it fast, who made it profitable. And he took credit. He trademarked it under his name. He told investors he was a visionary, and I was just the junior programmer lucky enough to work for him." Victor's jaw tightened, but he let her talk. And I let him. I stepped back. I raised Daniel and Eric. I went to the PTA meetings and the soccer games. I made our home while he built his empire on my foundation. And now he's throwing me away like I'm nothing. Like I was never anything. Your father would have punched him. Victor's voice was quiet but fierce. Bob Miller didn't tolerate bullies. Margaret smiled despite herself. Dad would have done more than punch him. Your father saved my life. Victor leaned back in his chair, staring at a spot on the ceiling. Did I ever tell you the whole story? Just bits and pieces. I was driving home from a case in Philadelphia. It was raining dark. I was exhausted. I ran a red light on I-95 without even seeing it. An 18-wheeler T-boned my car. I should have died. The whole driver's side was crushed. I was trapped. The car was on fire and I couldn't get out. I was screaming, but nobody stopped. Rush hour traffic, everyone in a hurry. He looked at her now, his eyes bright with old grief. Then your father stopped. He was driving home from his night shift cleaning offices. He pulled over, ran across 4 lanes of traffic, smashed my window with a tire iron and dragged me out 30 seconds before the gas tank exploded. His hands were bleeding. He'd cut them on the glass. And when the paramedics came, when I tried to thank him, he just said, anyone would have done it. Margaret's throat tightened. That sounded exactly like her father. But they wouldn't have. Everyone else drove past. Bob Miller was the only one who stopped. Later, when I was in the hospital, he visited. Brought me magazines and terrible coffee. Never asked for anything. Never even told me his last name. It took me 2 weeks to track him down so I could pay his hospital bills for the hand surgery. Victor opened a drawer and pulled out a faded photograph. It showed a younger Victor in a hospital bed, grinning despite the bandages, and Bob Miller standing beside him in his janitor's uniform, looking uncomfortable with the attention. I told him, I owe you a debt I can never repay. And he said, just take care of my Maggie if she ever needs it. She's smart, but she's too kind. The world eats people like her. I promised him. That was 22 years ago. And when he died, when I stood at his funeral and watched you cry, I swore I'd keep that promise. Margaret took the photograph with shaking hands. Her father looked so young, so alive. He'd been gone 5 years, and the grief still hit like a fresh wound. So tell me, Maggie, what do you need? She set down the photograph and pulled out her laptop. I need you to help me destroy my husband. For the next 2 hours, Margaret walked Victor through the data. She showed him the audit trail she'd built into the code 20 years ago. She explained how every transaction Bailey Logistics had ever processed was recorded twice, once in the visible system, once in her hidden backup. She demonstrated how she could trace every dollar that had moved through the company. And as she clicked through spreadsheets and database logs, a story emerged that made Victor's expression grow darker with each revelation. Thomas hadn't just been unfaithful, he'd been criminal. $12 million skimmed from the employee pension fund, moved through a network of Delaware shell companies with names like TBH Holdings and Bailey Ventures, LLC. Another $8 million in gambling debts from Atlantic City casinos covered by falsifying quarterly earnings reports. $40 million laundered for Frank Moretti, a Boston organized crime figure using fake shipping manifests through the Port of New York and New Jersey. Jesus Christ. Victor sat back, his face pale. Maggie, this isn't just divorce material. This is federal. I know. The pension fund alone that's people's retirement, Linda Reeves, Martinez from the loading dock, your father's old work buddies who got jobs there after Bailey bought the warehousing company. Margaret's chest tightened. I know. And the money laundering. That's RICO. That's FBI jurisdiction. I know. Her voice cracked. Victor, he didn't just steal from me. He stole from everyone. From people who trusted him. From families who are counting on that pension to survive. And he did it while looking them in the eye and telling them they were family. Victor was quiet for a long moment, studying the spreadsheets on her laptop screen. When did you realize about the fraud, I mean? Pieces of it years ago. The offshore accounts maybe 10 years back. But I told myself I must be wrong. that Thomas wouldn't, that there must be a legitimate explanation. She laughed bitterly. I was such an idiot. You weren't an idiot. You were loyal. I was a coward. Margaret closed the laptop with more force than necessary. I saw the numbers not adding up, and I looked away because it was easier than admitting my husband was a criminal. I let him steal from our friends because confronting him would have meant blowing up my life. And now he's already blown it up, so I might as well make sure he doesn't take anyone else down with him. Victor pulled out a legal pad and started making notes. We need to organize this for the DA. Timeline, transaction IDs, witness statements. This is going to be the case of my career, Maggie. And I'm 77 years old. 67. I feel 77 right now. But he was smiling the smile of a litigator scenting blood in the water. Thomas made one fatal mistake. Just one. He underestimated you. Narcissists always do. They think silence means weakness. But sometimes silence is just the smartest person in the room taking notes. Margaret felt something shift inside her chest like a locked door finally opening. He's planning something. A party. A party. She pulled out her phone and showed him the email invitation she'd received that morning. Victor read it, his eyebrows climbing toward his hairline. A celebration of new beginnings at the plaza. Is he serious? 300 guests, open bar, live jazz band. He's throwing a party to celebrate divorcing me. Victor seemed to search for words adequate to the situation. That's the most arrogant thing I've heard in 40 years of law practice. That's Thomas. Victor set down the phone, a slow smile spreading across his face. Then let's give him a party he'll never forget. Over the next 3 months, Margaret Miller transformed. Not in the obvious ways. She didn't get plastic surgery or buy a new wardrobe or suddenly start posting inspirational quotes about self-love on social media. The transformation was deeper, quieter, more fundamental. She moved out of the Brooklyn apartment into a smaller studio in Sunset Park. The neighborhood was grittier, the apartment tiny, but it was hers. She painted the walls herself in soft gray. She bought a second-hand desk and set up her laptop. She started sleeping through the night again for the first time in years. Linda Reeves, her best friend and the warehouse supervisor at Bailey Logistics, helped her move. They'd met 20 years ago when Bailey had acquired a smaller warehousing company, and Margaret had insisted Thomas hire everyone instead of laying them off. Linda was 52, a tough woman from the Bronx who'd raised 2 kids alone and didn't take crap from anyone. This is cozy. Linda set down a box of kitchen supplies and looked around the studio with approval. I like it. It's honest. It's tiny. Margaret taped up the last moving box. Tiny and honest. Better than that museum Thomas kept in Manhattan. Linda opened the box and started arranging dishes in the narrow kitchen. You know what I never told you? I always hated going to your place. Everything was so expensive I was afraid to sit down. Margaret laughed. I felt the same way. So what's the plan now? You're going to take Thomas to the cleaners? Something like that? Linda stopped arranging dishes and looked at her friend carefully. Maggie, what's going on? You've been different since the divorce papers. Quieter, but not sad quiet. Strategic quiet. Margaret hesitated. She and Linda had been friends for 2 decades, but dragging her into this felt dangerous. Then again, Linda deserved to know. Her pension was in that fund Thomas had raided. Can you keep a secret? I've kept your secret about dyeing your hair for 5 years. I think I can handle one more. Despite herself, Margaret smiled. I don't dye my hair. Exactly. Because you're too cheap. Which is why I know something big is happening if you're asking me to keep secrets. Margaret sat down on the floor, her back against the wall. Linda joined her, and for a moment they were just 2 middle-aged women sitting in an empty apartment, sunlight streaming through the window, dust motes dancing in the air. Thomas stole from the pension fund. Linda went very still. What? $12 million. Moved it through shell companies. Your retirement, Martinez, is everyone's. It's gone. The color drained from Linda's face. "I'm 52 years old. That pension is all I have. My kids are still in college. I can't afford to lose that money, Maggie. I can't afford to start over." "I know, which is why I'm going to get it back." "How?" So Margaret told her about the audit trail in the code, about Victor Hayes and the evidence they were compiling, about the FBI and the DA and the plan to bring it all crashing down on Thomas's head at the most public moment possible. When she finished, Linda was crying quietly. "You're going to save us." "I'm going to try." "No." Linda grabbed her hand, squeezing hard. "You're going to save us, because you're the smartest person I know, and when you set your mind to something you don't quit. You never quit." That afternoon, after Linda left, Margaret met with Victor at a coffee shop in Park Slope. He arrived with another man, someone Margaret had never seen before. The stranger was in his early 50s with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a suit that looked expensive but not showy and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was worth. "Maggie, this is David Green, forensic accountant, best in the business." Victor made the introductions while David ordered a black coffee. "Ms. Miller?" David shook her hand with a firm grip. "I've been reviewing the evidence you compiled. It's exceptional work." "Thank you." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. Compliments from strangers always made her uncomfortable. Most people wouldn't know what to look for. "Do you have an accounting background?" "No, just programming. But programmers learn to follow the money. Everything leaves a trail in the data." David smiled, genuine and warm. "The best forensic accountants I've ever worked with were all programmers. You understand systems. You see patterns." He opened his laptop and pulled up a spreadsheet. "I've been organizing your evidence for the DA. We're focusing on 3 main charges: pension fund embezzlement, securities fraud, and money laundering. The RICO charges are bonus." RICO. Margaret knew the term from crime shows, but not much more. Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, used for prosecuting organized crime. Frank Moretti has been on the FBI's radar for years, but they could never get enough evidence to make charges stick. Your husband's shipping manifests are going to give them everything they need. And when they roll up, Moretti Thomas becomes a cooperating witness or goes down with him. Victor leaned forward. Either way, Thomas loses. Cooperate and he becomes a snitch, which means Moretti's people will make sure prison is very uncomfortable. Don't cooperate and he gets maximum sentences on all charges stacked. Margaret felt a strange disconnect, like she was watching this conversation happen to someone else. They were talking about sending her husband to federal prison, the father of her children, the man she'd loved enough to marry when she was 28 and stupid with hope. How long would he serve? Her voice came out smaller than she intended. David and Victor exchanged a glance. Conservatively, 25 to 30 years. With good behavior, maybe 20. Thomas was 52. He'd be in his 70s before he saw freedom again. Daniel and Eric would be middle-aged men with children of their own. The world would have moved on without him. "Ms. Miller," David's voice was gentle, "if this is too much, if you want to pursue just the divorce and let the criminal charges go, no one would blame you. And the pension fund? Likely lost. Without the criminal case, there's no mechanism to recover the money. Thomas would declare bankruptcy, liquidate personal assets, pay creditors, and everyone gets pennies on the dollar. What about Linda and Martinez? And the other 200 people counting on that money? They'd be among those creditors fighting over pennies." Margaret thought about Linda crying in her new apartment, about Martinez, who was 60 and had already postponed retirement twice because he couldn't afford it, about all the people who'd trusted Thomas, who'd believed him when he called them family. "Then we proceed, all of it, criminal charges, civil suits, everything." David nodded slowly. "Then we need to build an airtight case. The DA will want witness testimony. We'll need Marcus Green, the CFO. He's complicit, but if we offer immunity for cooperation, he might flip. Marcus has 3 kids. Margaret remembered them from company picnics, gap-toothed and sticky with ice cream. If he goes to prison, they lose their father. If he cooperates, he gets immunity, a deal. He testifies against Thomas, he walks. Victor added, Marcus isn't the villain here, Maggie. He's another victim. Thomas pressured him into cooking the books, threatened to blacklist him from every financial position in New York if he didn't comply. We have emails proving it. Margaret felt the weight of decisions she'd never wanted to make. Offer him the deal. I don't want to destroy families if I don't have to. That's the difference between you and Thomas right there. David closed his laptop. He destroyed families without thinking twice. You're trying to save them even when they participated in hurting you. Over the next weeks, Margaret fell into a rhythm. Days she worked a programming contract job she'd picked up through an old colleague building inventory management systems for a small logistics company. Nights she worked with Victor and David organizing evidence, preparing witness statements, building the case that would bring down her husband. She saw her sons on weekends. Daniel came home from Harvard for Thanksgiving, full of stories about his economics classes and new friends. He asked about the divorce with the careful awkwardness of a 19-year-old trying to navigate his parents' dissolution. Margaret kept her answers vague. She signed the papers. Dad was moving on. Everything was fine. Eric, at 16, was more perceptive. He found her one evening in her studio apartment surrounded by legal documents and financial spreadsheets. "Mom, what are you doing?" She looked up from her laptop, suddenly aware of how the scene must look. "Just organizing some files." "For what?" "Adult stuff. Nothing for you to worry about." Eric sat down on her bed, the only real furniture in the small space besides the desk and a rickety chair. "Is Dad in trouble?" Margaret's hands stilled on the keyboard. "Why would you ask that?" "Because you're not sad. After he left, I thought you'd be crying all the time. But you're not. You're just busy, like you're working on a project." He looked at her with eyes that were too knowing for 16. "You're planning something." She could lie. Should lie. Eric was still a child, Thomas's son, deserving of whatever innocence remained in this shattered family. But he was also sharp, and she'd raised him to value honesty. "Your father made some bad choices. I'm making sure there are consequences." "Good." Eric's voice was fierce. "He deserves it." "Eric, he cheated on you, Mom. I'm not stupid. I saw the texts on his phone 2 years ago. I heard him on calls when he thought I was asleep. And he acted like you were nothing. Like we were nothing. So, yeah, whatever you're doing, I hope it hurts him." Margaret's throat tightened. "I'm sorry you had to see that. I'm sorry you had to live it." They sat in silence for a while, mother and son both carrying the weight of Thomas Bailey's betrayals. Finally, Eric stood to leave. "Mom, when this is over, whatever this is, are you going to be okay?" "I'm going to be better than okay." She said it with more confidence than she felt, but Eric smiled anyway. 2 weeks before the party, David showed up at Margaret's apartment with Thai food and a bottle of wine. They'd fallen into a comfortable working relationship over the past months, meeting twice a week to review evidence and strategize. Victor usually joined them, but tonight he'd begged off, claiming his back was acting up. "I think he's playing matchmaker." David unpacked containers of pad thai and curry, the smell filling the small studio. Margaret nearly dropped the wine glasses she was pulling from the cabinet. "What?" "Victor. He keeps finding reasons to leave us alone. Last week it was a doctor's appointment. Week before was a conflict with another case. Tonight, back pain." David grinned. "He's not subtle." "That's ridiculous. We're working." Margaret busied herself with pouring wine, heat creeping up her neck. "We are. And we could keep it strictly professional if you want. But I should tell you in the interest of full disclosure that I find you remarkable." Margaret looked up. David was watching her with an expression that made her heart do something complicated in her chest. "I'm a 48-year-old divorced mother of 2 who lives in a studio apartment and spends her evenings plotting her ex-husband's downfall. That's not remarkable. That's possibly unhinged." You're a brilliant programmer who built an empire for an ungrateful narcissist, then quietly documented his crimes for 20 years in case you ever needed proof of his corruption. You're fighting to recover pension funds for people who have no idea you're their champion. You're raising two good sons despite their father being a criminal. And you're doing all of it with grace and dignity. David took the wine glass from her hand, his fingers brushing hers. That's the definition of remarkable. I'm also terrified most of the time. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing the right thing despite it. They ate Thai food sitting on her floor because her apartment didn't have a kitchen table. David told her about his late wife Sarah, who'd died 3 years ago after a 2-year battle with breast cancer, how he'd stayed by her bedside through chemotherapy and radiation, how he'd held her hand when she died and felt like he'd lost his anchor to the world. Margaret told him about her father, Bob Miller, the janitor who'd raised her to value honest work and kindness above all else. How he'd worked night shifts cleaning offices so she could go to college. How he'd cried when she graduated not because he was sad, but because he was so proud. How he'd died of a heart attack 5 years ago suddenly and without warning, and she still sometimes reached for the phone to call him before remembering he was gone. He would have liked you. Margaret surprised herself by saying it. Dad appreciated people who worked hard and didn't put on airs. I would have liked him too. Any man who raised you must have been extraordinary. When David left that night, he kissed her on the cheek at the door, gentle and respectful. It was the most chaste kiss imaginable, and it left Margaret's heart racing like she was 26 again. The final week before the party was a blur of preparation. Victor filed preliminary motions with the court sealed so Thomas wouldn't know what was coming. David finalized spreadsheets and transaction reports for the DA. Margaret backed up all her evidence in 3 separate locations, paranoid that something might go wrong at the last moment. She also made one final trip to a bank in Lower Manhattan. First National had been holding Safe Deposit Box 404 under joint custody since 1998, when Thomas had opened it to store their marriage license and some family heirlooms as a romantic gesture. Over the years, Thomas had cleared out the heirlooms and started using the box for his own purposes. But he'd never bothered to remove Margaret's name from the authorization card. I've lost my key. Margaret stood at the bank manager's desk, her hands folded calmly in her lap. I need to access the box for some family documents. The manager checked her ID, verified her signature, and 20 minutes later, Margaret was sitting alone in a small private room with the contents of Box 404 spread before her. A black waterproof bag. Inside a ledger bound in leather filled with handwritten entries in Thomas's distinctive scrawl. Dates, container numbers, payment amounts, and signatures. Signatures from officials at the Port of New York and New Jersey, signatures from customs inspectors who'd looked the other way, and most damningly multiple signatures from Senator Harold Ashford, the squeaky clean politician with presidential ambitions. Thomas had been keeping insurance. Proof of everyone he'd bribed, everyone who'd helped him move illegal shipments through U.S. ports. If he ever went down, he planned to take half of New York's political establishment with him. Margaret photographed every page with her phone. Then she removed the ledger and replaced it with a single playing card, the Queen of Spades. She left a note tucked beside it, written in her neat handwriting, "The house always wins. M." The night of November 14th arrived cold and clear. Margaret stood in her studio apartment looking at herself in the mirror mounted on the bathroom door. She wore the same beige cardigan she'd had on the night Thomas served her with divorce papers, paired with comfortable jeans and sneakers. Her hair was pulled back in its usual messy bun. She looked exactly like what Thomas had called her beige. Perfect. Her phone buzzed. "Victor, in position. FBI is standing by. You sure you don't want to attend?" She typed back, "I'm sure. This isn't about me being there. It's about him realizing too late that I was always there." Margaret made herself a cup of tea and settled at her desk. On her laptop screen, she pulled up the security feed from the Plaza Hotel. It had taken David 3 days to hack into their system, and he'd made her promise never to tell anyone he knew how to do that. But there it was, A live view of the ballroom where 300 guests were gathering to celebrate the end of her marriage. She watched Thomas work the room Ashley Vaughn on his arm like a designer accessory, watched him laugh and shake hands and accept congratulations, watched him climb onto the stage and take the microphone, his face flushed with champagne and arrogance. And she watched Victor Hayes sitting quietly at table 22 in the back, eating his dinner with the patience of a man who knew exactly how the evening would end. The tea in Margaret's cup had gone cold by the time it happened. By the time Thomas Bailey's entire world collapsed in front of 300 witnesses and went viral before he'd even been led away in handcuffs. By the time the music stopped and the lights came on, and the man who'd called her beige learned exactly what shade of brilliant she'd always been. But that story, the story of how silence became a weapon and patience became power, was just beginning. The Plaza Ballroom glittered like a jewelry box turned inside out. Crystal chandeliers threw prismatic light across 300 guests dressed in their Manhattan finest, while a 12-piece jazz ensemble played something smooth and expensive in the corner. Thomas Bailey had spared no expense for his celebration, and it showed in every detail: the ice sculpture of a phoenix rising from flames, the champagne fountains, the caviar stations staffed by servers in white gloves. Margaret watched it all through her laptop screen, the security feed showing her a party she'd chosen not to attend. She sat cross-legged on her studio apartment floor, tea forgotten beside her as Thomas moved through the crowd accepting congratulations like a conquering general. Ashley Vaughn clung to his arm in a red dress that cost more than Margaret's monthly rent. The girl, and at 26 she was very much a girl, looked nervous despite the champagne. She kept glancing around as if waiting for something to go wrong, but Thomas seemed oblivious to her anxiety. He was too busy basking in the attention, shaking hands and laughing too loud at jokes that probably weren't funny. At table 22, Victor Hayes cut into his prime rib with surgical precision. He'd dressed for the occasion in a suit Margaret had never seen before, charcoal gray and perfectly tailored. He looked like exactly what he was, an expensive attorney who belonged at events like this. Nobody would guess he was about to detonate a bomb in the middle of Manhattan's social elite. The jazz band finished their set. The lights dimmed. A spotlight hit the stage and Thomas bounded up the stairs with the energy of a man 20 years younger. He grabbed the microphone like he owned it. "Ladies and gentlemen, friends, competitors, and those of you secretly hoping I crash and burn." He paused for the polite laughter that rippled through the crowd. "Tonight is a very special night." Margaret's hands tightened on her laptop. Here it came. "They say marriage is a marathon, and I just crossed the finish line." More laughter, though some of it sounded uncomfortable now. 20 years is a long time, and I want to thank Margaret, wherever she is tonight, for being a solid companion through the early years when Bailey Logistics was just getting started. Solid, not brilliant, not essential, solid like a piece of furniture that served its purpose but could be replaced. But businesses evolve, and so do people. Bailey Logistics is entering a new era. We're expanding throughout the Northeast, our stock is at an all-time high, and personally, he pulled Ashley closer. I've never felt younger or more alive. Thomas raised his champagne flute. "So I wanted to invite all of you here, not just to drink my excellent champagne, but to witness the beginning of the next chapter. No more looking back, no more dead weight. To the future." The crowd echoed the toast, 300 crystal glasses catching the light. Margaret watched Ashley's face on the screen. The girl was smiling, but something behind her eyes looked desperate. She knows, Margaret thought. Maybe not the details, but she knows this isn't normal. That celebrating a divorce like a corporate merger isn't what healthy people do. Thomas drained his glass in one long swallow. He scanned the crowd with satisfaction, making eye contact with the powerful and ignoring the less useful. His gaze snagged on something in the back of the room, a chair scraping against the parquet floor. The sound carried through the ballroom's acoustics, jarring and wrong in the aftermath of the toast. Victor Hayes stood up. He was holding a napkin in one hand and his briefcase in the other, moving with the deliberate slowness of someone who wanted every eye in the room on him. Thomas squinted against the spotlight. "Excuse me, can we get security? I think we have a party crasher." Two large men in black suits started moving toward table 22, but Victor's voice cut through the room before they could reach him, decades of courtroom projection making a microphone unnecessary. Thomas Bailey. Thomas froze. He knew that voice. Margaret watched recognition dawn across her ex-husband's face, followed by confusion, then the first flicker of fear. Victor Hayes." Thomas forced a laugh. "What are you doing here? I fired you 10 years ago for being too much of a Boy Scout. You fired me because I told you that using company funds to pay for your mistress's apartment was embezzlement. Her name was Lisa, if memory serves. Your first affair." Victor started walking toward the stage, the crowd parting to let him through. "Not your last, but definitely your first." Ashley's champagne flute slipped from her hand. It shattered on the marble floor, the sound like a gunshot in the sudden silence. "Get him out of here." Thomas's voice had lost its jovial tone. "Security now. If you remove me—" Victor reached into his briefcase, pulling out a thick document bound in blue legal tape. "You forfeit your right to contest the evidence I'm about to present to the Board of Directors of Bailey Logistics, and more importantly, to the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Thomas's hand tightened on his champagne flute until the stem snapped. Glass and wine spilled over his hand like blood, but he didn't seem to notice. "What evidence? What the hell are you talking about?" "I'm talking about 20 years of fraud, Thomas. I'm talking about the real reason Bailey Logistics has been so profitable." Victor had reached the foot of the stage now. He looked up at Thomas with an expression Margaret recognized from photographs of him in court, the patient, predatory focus of a lawyer who knew he'd already won. "I'm talking about the fact that you don't own 51% of this company. Margaret Miller does." The gasp that went through the room sucked all the oxygen out of the air. Margaret watched phones come out, people starting to record. This was going to be viral within minutes. "That's a lie." Thomas descended from the stage, leaving bloody footprints from his cut hand. "The prenup is airtight. Maggie gets nothing. The prenup gives her nothing in a standard divorce. But we're not invoking the standard terms. We're invoking Clause 14, the infidelity and gross financial misconduct provision." Victor smiled, and it wasn't a nice smile. "You were careful, Thomas. Encrypted messaging apps, cash payments to your mistresses, burner phones. But you forgot something crucial." The massive LCD screen behind Thomas flickered to life. Thomas spun around his face, going from red to white in an instant. "Margaret didn't just support your business, Thomas. She built it. Every line of code in your logistics tracking system came from her mind. And when she built that code, she included something you never bothered to look for." Victor pulled a USB drive from his pocket, holding it up like evidence in a trial. "A shadow database. An audit trail. For 20 years, every transaction Bailey Logistics processed was recorded twice, once in the system you and your team saw, once in a backup only Margaret could access." The first image appeared on the screen. It was a chat log from an encrypted messaging app dated 8 months earlier. "Thomas to Marcus Green. She's clueless. I'll have the Delaware assets moved before the divorce papers are filed. By the time she signs, the main accounts will look empty. She'll get pennies while I keep millions." Marcus to Thomas. "This is risky. If she audits Thomas to Marcus, she won't. She's a housewife now. She hasn't looked at a balance sheet in 10 years. I'm trading her in for a 26-year-old model, cheaper maintenance and way better in bed." Margaret watched Ashley's face crumple on the security feed. The girl looked around wildly as if searching for an exit, but the crowd had closed in around the spectacle. There was nowhere to run. "That's doctored." Thomas's voice cracked. "Those messages are fake. Deep fakes or whatever. You can't trust." The screen changed. Now it showed bank transfers, dates, and amounts highlighted in yellow. April 12th, $450,000 to Vaughn Consulting LLC, Ashley's shell company. June 3rd, $200,000 for a Corvette registered in her name. August 7th, $100,000 marked wardrobe allowance. Then came the email that made the crowd's murmur turn into a roar. Thomas to his personal attorney, dated 2 weeks ago. "Make sure Ashley doesn't get access to the real accounts. I want her on an allowance. Once the divorce is final, I'll need to phase her out too. She's fun for now, but she's not long-term material. Give it a year, then we'll find a way to void her NDAs and cut her loose." Ashley walked onto the stage. Her heels clicked against the wood, each step deliberate. The crowd quieted, sensing something bigger was about to happen. She stood in front of Thomas, her face streaked with mascara, her hands shaking. "Fun for now." Her voice was barely a whisper, but the microphone caught it. "Ashley, baby, listen, that email was taken out of context." The slap echoed through the ballroom. Ashley's palm connected with Thomas's face hard enough to snap his head to the side, hard enough that the sound registered on Margaret's laptop speakers 2 miles away in Brooklyn. "I thought you loved me." Ashley was crying openly now, not caring who saw. "You said I was your soulmate. You said Margaret never understood you. You said you were a line item, my dear." Victor's voice cut through her breakdown with clinical precision. "Just like Margaret. Just like everyone in this room is to him. Thomas Bailey doesn't see people. He sees assets to exploit and liabilities to discard." The screen changed again. This time what appeared made several people in the crowd stand up and start edging toward the exits. It was a spreadsheet titled Pension Fund Reallocation 2015 to 2024. Line by line it showed $12 million being systematically skimmed from employee retirement accounts and moved through a network of Delaware shell companies. TBH Holdings, LLC, Bailey Ventures, Northeast Logistics Consulting, each one a paper entity with Thomas as the sole beneficiary. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're seeing is 20 years of systematic theft." Victor walked to the center of the room, turning slowly to address the entire crowd. Every time Thomas reported a bonus to shareholders, that money was actually being funneled into offshore accounts. Every time Bailey Logistics showed record profits, those numbers were fabricated. And the money that was supposed to secure the retirement of 200 warehouse workers, shipping clerks, and logistics coordinators, that money bought the Corvette parked outside. It paid for this party. It's currently sitting in accounts in Delaware and Nevada, while people like Linda Reeves, who's worked for this company for 20 years, face retirement with nothing. Marcus Green stood up from his table. His face was ashen, his hand gripping his wife's shoulder like he might collapse without the support. "Victor, I can explain." "Save it for the FBI, Marcus. They're very interested in your explanations." Victor checked his watch. "They should be arriving right about now." As if on cue, the ballroom's main doors swung open. 6 NYPD officers entered, followed by 2 agents in FBI windbreakers. The lead agent, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense expression, held up her badge. "Thomas Bailey, you're under arrest for wire fraud, securities fraud, money laundering, and embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent." Thomas bolted. He actually tried to run, stumbling off the stage and shoving through the crowd toward a side exit. He made it maybe 20 feet before 2 officers tackled him. They went down in a heap of designer suits and handcuffs, Thomas screaming about his rights and his lawyers and how this was illegal entrapment. Margaret watched through her screen as they hauled him upright. His tuxedo was torn at the shoulder. His face was bleeding from where he'd hit the floor. His carefully styled hair stood up in clumps. He looked nothing like the polished CEO who'd stood on that stage 5 minutes ago proclaiming his new beginning. He looked small and scared and old. The FBI agent finished reading him his Miranda rights while flashbulbs popped. Every phone in the ballroom was recording. By morning, #BaileyFall would be trending higher than the Super Bowl. "This is Margaret's doing." Thomas twisted in the officer's grip, trying to see Victor through the crowd. "That bitch set me up. She hacked the system. This is illegal search and seizure. My lawyers will—" "Your wife didn't hack anything, Mr. Bailey." The FBI agent's voice was tired, like she'd heard this exact defense 1,000 times. "She built the system. As the original architect, she included standard audit protocols, all perfectly legal. In fact, you're the one who violated federal wiretapping laws by using encrypted apps to coordinate criminal activity." They started walking him toward the exit. The crowd parted, everyone desperate to avoid being associated with the man in handcuffs. Thomas's eyes swept the ballroom one last time, landing on Ashley, who was crying into her hands, and Marcus, who was talking urgently to a lawyer on his phone, and all the friends and colleagues who were suddenly very interested in the floor. "You're all going to regret this." Thomas's voice was hoarse. "I built this industry. I'm the king of logistics in this city. You think you can just—" The doors closed behind him, cutting off whatever else he'd planned to say. Victor Hayes closed his briefcase with a soft click. He looked directly at one of the security cameras Margaret was watching through and gave the smallest nod. Message received, she thought. It's done. Her phone buzzed. A text from David. Turn on the news. Margaret switched feeds on her laptop. Every major network had broken into regular programming. The chyron on CNN read, "Logistics CEO arrested at divorce party on federal fraud charges." They were already running the footage cell phone videos from the ballroom showing Thomas being tackled, Ashley's slap, Victor's calm destruction of a man's entire life. A legal analyst was already weighing in. "This is one of the most dramatic white-collar arrests we've seen in years. The audacity of celebrating a divorce while federal agents prepared to arrest you is almost Shakespearean in its hubris." Margaret closed her laptop. She stood up, her legs stiff from sitting cross-legged for so long, and walked to her window. The Brooklyn night stretched out before her, lights glittering across the borough. Somewhere in Manhattan, Thomas was being processed into the system, fingerprinted, photographed, stripped of his expensive watch and his freedom. She should feel triumphant. This was victory complete and total. But all she felt was tired. Her phone rang. Victor's number. "Did you watch?" he asked without preamble. "Every second." "How are you feeling?" Margaret pressed her forehead against the cold window glass. "Ask me tomorrow." "Fair enough. The DA wants to meet. Day after tomorrow work for you?" "I'll be there." "And Maggie, your father would be proud." She hung up before the tears could come. But they came anyway, sliding down her cheeks as she stared out at the city that had just watched her ex-husband's empire collapse in real time. She cried for the 20 years she'd given him, for the woman she'd been at 28 who'd believed love and loyalty mattered, for the pension fund workers who might still lose everything if the federal recovery process failed, for her sons who would wake up tomorrow to see their father's mugshot on every news site in America. But underneath the grief was something else, something hard and bright and unbreakable. It felt like the foundation of a building that had survived an earthquake. Everything around it had collapsed, but the structure held. She was still standing. The next morning, Margaret's phone started ringing at 6 a.m. and didn't stop. Reporters wanting comments. Old colleagues from the early days of Bailey Logistics asking if she'd known. Her sister calling from Pittsburgh, frantic with worry. Daniel's number flashing repeatedly. He'd seen the news from Harvard and wanted answers she wasn't ready to give. She turned the phone off and went for a run. Brooklyn in November was cold enough to sting her lungs, but the pain felt clarifying. She ran until her legs burned and her mind went quiet, until she was just a woman moving through the city with no thoughts beyond the next block, the next breath. When she got back to her apartment, David was waiting outside her building with coffee and bagels. "How did you know where I live?" "Victor told me. He was worried about you." David held out the coffee like a peace offering. "I was too." "I'm fine." "You're really not. Can I come up?" Her studio apartment looked even smaller with David in it. He was tall enough that he had to duck slightly under the sloped ceiling near the window. He set the bagels on her desk and looked around at the sparse space, her second-hand furniture, her laptop surrounded by legal documents, the air mattress in the corner that served as her bed. "This is where you've been living." Something in his voice made her defensive. "It's cheap and it's mine. I don't need much." "Maggie, you built a $400 million company. You should have a penthouse somewhere." "Thomas has the penthouse, had I suppose. Federal asset forfeiture will take it soon enough." She opened the coffee, grateful for something to do with her hands. "This place suits me. It's honest." David sat on the floor, his back against the wall. After a moment, Margaret joined him. They ate bagels and drank coffee while the morning light crept across the hardwood. "The DA wants you to testify at trial." David's voice was careful. "Grand jury first, then the actual trial when it happens. You'll be the star witness." "I know. It's going to be brutal. Thomas's lawyers will try to destroy your credibility. They'll paint you as a vindictive ex-wife who fabricated evidence. They'll go after every mistake you ever made, every tax return, every parking ticket. They'll make you relive the worst moments of your marriage in front of a jury. I know that too. Victor and I can prep you. We'll do mock cross-examinations, practice sessions. By the time you take the stand, you'll be ready for anything they throw at you. Margaret looked at him, this kind man who'd lost his own wife to cancer, who understood grief and rebuilding, who treated her like an equal instead of a victim to be rescued. "Why are you doing this, David? Helping me, I mean. Victor has his promise to my father, but you don't owe me anything." David set down his coffee. He looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Because watching you fight back reminded me what courage looks like. After Sarah died, I spent 3 years going through the motions. Work, home, sleep, repeat. I told myself I was fine, but I was just empty. Then Victor called me about your case, and I saw what you'd done, how you'd documented everything, how you'd built a fortress of evidence brick by brick for 20 years just in case you ever needed it. That's not vindictiveness. That's the most brilliant long-term strategy I've ever seen." "It wasn't strategy. I'm a programmer. We document things. It's what we do." "You're more than a programmer, Maggie. You're the architect of the most spectacular takedown I've witnessed in 25 years of forensic accounting." He smiled, and it transformed his whole face. "Plus, I think you're remarkable. I thought I should mention that." The kiss happened so naturally that later Margaret couldn't say who moved first. One moment they were sitting against the wall. The next his hand was cupping her face and her fingers were tangled in his hair, and nothing existed except the warmth of his mouth and the feeling of being seen, really seen for the first time in decades. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, David rested his forehead against hers. "That was probably unprofessional. Extremely unprofessional." Margaret couldn't stop smiling. "Want to be unprofessional again?" They spent the morning tangled up in each other on her air mattress, learning the geography of bodies marked by time and loss and survival. There was nothing perfect about it. They were both too old for gymnastics, too scarred for the kind of thoughtless passion that belonged to the young. But it was real. It was honest. And when Margaret fell asleep in David's arms, she slept without nightmares for the first time since August. She woke to her phone buzzing. She'd turned it back on at some point, and now it was vibrating itself across the desk with the persistence of bad news that wouldn't be ignored. Daniel's number. She answered. Mom, what the hell is going on?" Her son's voice was raw. "I woke up to texts from everyone I know. Dad's face is all over the news. They're saying he stole millions. They're saying he's going to prison. Danny, I know this is hard. Did you know? Did you know he was doing this?" The question hung between them. David, awake now, squeezed her hand. "I knew some of it, not everything. I found out the extent of it when I started digging after he asked for the divorce." "And you turned him in?" "Not a question, an accusation. I gave evidence to the authorities, yes. He stole from people, Daniel, from our friends, from employees who trusted him. He laundered money for criminals. He's my father." Daniel's voice cracked. "And you destroyed him. Everyone at school is talking about it. My economics professor used it as a case study this morning. Do you have any idea how humiliating that is?" Margaret closed her eyes. "I'm sorry you're going through this. I truly am. But your father's choices destroyed him, not me. I just made sure there were consequences. You could have handled it privately, gotten a divorce, taken whatever settlement, moved on. Instead, you made it a public spectacle. That party arrest video has 50 million views, Mom. 50 million people watched my father get tackled by police. He threw that party to humiliate me, to celebrate getting rid of me in front of 300 people. I didn't make it a spectacle. He did." Silence on the other end of the line. She could hear Daniel breathing, could imagine him in his dorm room at Harvard trying to process a world where his father was a criminal and his mother was the one who'd exposed him. "I need time." His voice was small now, younger than 19. "I can't talk to you right now. I need time." "Okay." It wasn't okay, but what else could she say? I love you, Danny. That hasn't changed. He hung up without responding. David pulled her against his chest, letting her cry into his shirt. He'll come around. He's angry and confused and his whole world just imploded. But he's your son. He'll understand eventually. What if he doesn't? Then you keep loving him anyway. That's what parents do. The grand jury hearing happened 3 weeks later in a federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan. Margaret sat in a windowless room and answered questions for 4 hours straight, while 18 ordinary citizens listened to her explain how she'd built a logistics empire's software and discovered her husband's crimes. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Chen, who looked young enough to be Margaret's daughter, led her through the evidence methodically. The shadow database, the shell companies, the pension fund transfers, the money laundering. Ms. Miller, can you explain why you didn't report these irregularities when you first noticed them? Margaret took a breath. This was the question she'd been dreading, the one David had warned her about. I didn't want to believe my husband was a criminal. I told myself there must be legitimate explanations, that I was misunderstanding the transactions, that Thomas wouldn't steal from people who trusted him. She looked at the jury, at their faces ranging from sympathetic to skeptical. I was wrong, and by the time I admitted that to myself, he'd been operating this scheme for 15 years. I should have acted sooner. That's something I'll have to live with. The honesty seemed to satisfy them. Or maybe they just recognized the particular shame of loving someone who turned out to be a monster. Either way, the grand jury voted to indict Thomas Bailey on 24 federal charges. The trial was set for February. Margaret spent Thanksgiving with Eric, just the two of them, in her studio apartment. She'd bought a rotisserie chicken from the grocery store and made stuffing from a box. It was the saddest Thanksgiving meal she'd ever prepared, but Eric ate 3 helpings and told her it was the best food he'd had in months. Dad called from jail. Eric pushed stuffing around his plate. They let him make calls on holidays, I guess. What did he say? That you framed him, that the evidence is fabricated, that his lawyers are going to prove he's innocent. Eric looked up, his 16-year-old face trying so hard to be adult. He's lying, right? He actually did all those things. Yes, sweetheart, he did. I kind of knew. I wanted to believe he wouldn't. Eric set down his fork. Is it okay if I'm mad at both of you? At him for doing it, and you for exposing it? Margaret reached across the tiny table and took her son's hand. You can feel however you need to feel. I'm not going anywhere. Danny won't talk to me. He says I'm betraying Dad by staying in contact with you. Your brother is processing this his own way. Give him time. Do you think we'll ever be a family again? Not like before, but some version of okay. Margaret thought about Thomas in a cell at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, probably eating the same terrible turkey the other inmates were choking down. She thought about Daniel at Harvard, too angry to answer her calls. She thought about the trial that would consume months of her life and splash every detail of her failed marriage across the news. I think we'll build something new. It won't look like what we had, but maybe it'll be stronger, more honest. I hope so. Eric squeezed her hand. Because I really miss having a family. That night, after Eric had gone back to his friend's house where he was staying until Thomas's situation resolved, Margaret sat at her laptop and opened her email. There was one from Victor with the subject line, Developments. She clicked it open. Maggie Thomas tried to make a deal with the DA today. He claims to have information about Senator Harold Ashford's involvement in the port corruption scheme. Says he can give them a ledger with dates, payments, signatures. In exchange, he wants immunity on the money laundering charges and a reduced sentence. Thought you should know. We're meeting with the DA tomorrow to discuss. V. Margaret stared at the email for a long time. Then she walked to her closet and pulled out the black waterproof bag she'd taken from the safe deposit box. Inside the leather ledger sat exactly where she'd left it, filled with Thomas's handwriting and Senator Ashford's signatures. She'd known this moment would come. Thomas was desperate, and desperate men bargain with whatever they have left. He thought the ledger was his ace in the hole, his one chance to negotiate his way out of a 30-year sentence. But Margaret had taken his ace, and she'd left him nothing but the queen of spades. Her phone rang. David's number. "I heard about Thomas's offer." His voice was tight with concern. "Victor filled me in. Maggie, if you have that ledger, if you took it from the safe deposit box like we suspected—" "I have it." "Then we need to give it to the FBI. Now, before Thomas realizes it's gone and accuses you of obstruction." "I know. There's more. Victor didn't want to tell you over email. Senator Ashford knows. Someone tipped him off that Thomas was trying to make a deal, and now Ashford's people are asking questions about who might have evidence against him." Margaret felt cold spread through her chest. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that make the FBI nervous. They want to put you in protective custody until the trial, just as a precaution." "Absolutely not. I'm not hiding." "Maggie, please listen. I've spent 20 years being quiet and invisible, making myself small so Thomas could feel big. I'm done hiding David. If Senator Ashford wants to come after me, let him try. I have evidence that will bury him alongside my ex-husband." David was quiet for a moment. "You're the bravest person I've ever met, also possibly the most stubborn." "I prefer determined." "Victor wants to meet tomorrow, 9 a.m. at his office. Can you make it?" "I'll be there. I love you, by the way. Seemed like a good time to mention it." Margaret smiled despite the knot of fear in her stomach. "I love you too. Also seemed like a good time." She hung up and looked at the ledger again. 20 years ago, she'd been a 28-year-old programmer who thought love meant trusting completely, who'd signed a prenup without reading it carefully because Thomas had asked her to, and that was what you did when you loved someone. Now she was 48, and she knew better. Love wasn't blind trust. It was eyes-wide-open honesty. It was David knowing every ugly truth about her marriage and choosing her anyway. It was Eric sitting in her studio apartment eating boxed stuffing and telling her he missed having a family. She picked up the ledger and put it in her bag. Tomorrow she'd give it to the FBI and watch another powerful man's world implode. Tonight she allowed herself one moment of satisfaction. Thomas had tried to use her like a pawn in his own game. He'd assumed she'd be too scared or too loyal or too stupid to fight back. He'd called her beige and dead weight and boring. But pawns that survived long enough could become queens, and queens didn't negotiate with men who'd already lost. She texted Victor, "I'll bring the ledger tomorrow. Let's finish this." His response came immediately. "That's my girl." Margaret turned off the lights in her studio apartment and climbed into her air mattress. Outside, Brooklyn hummed with its nighttime symphony of sirens and car horns, and humanity compressed into two small spaces. She'd gone from a penthouse to a studio, from a CEO's wife to a single woman rebuilding her life from scratch. But she'd also gone from silence to testimony, from invisible to unstoppable, from dead weight to the architect of the most spectacular corporate takedown in New York history. Thomas Bailey had called it a celebration of new beginnings. He'd been right about that at least, just not in the way he'd imagined. Margaret closed her eyes and dreamed of courtrooms and justice, and a future where her sons would understand that sometimes love meant tearing down what was broken so something stronger could rise from the ruins. Victor's office at 9 a.m. looked like a war room. The conference table was covered with documents, legal pads filled with notes, 3 laptops running simultaneously. David was already there, organizing files into color-coded folders. The FBI agent from the Plaza arrest, Special Agent Sarah Chen, sat in the corner reviewing something on her tablet. Margaret walked in carrying the black waterproof bag. All conversation stopped. "Is that it?" Victor stood, his eyes fixed on the bag like it might explode. She set it on the table and unzipped it slowly. The leather ledger emerged innocent-looking for something that could destroy a senator's career. Agent Chen crossed the room in 3 strides, pulling on latex gloves before touching it. "How long have you had this?" The agent's voice was professional, but Margaret caught the edge underneath. "Since November 13th, the day before the Plaza party. I removed it from a safe deposit box I co-owned with Thomas." You removed evidence from a federal investigation. There was no federal investigation when I took it. Thomas hadn't been arrested yet, and the box was legally mine as much as his. Margaret met the agent's gaze without flinching. I secured evidence I knew he'd try to destroy or use as leverage, which is exactly what he's attempting to do now. Agent Chen flipped through pages, her expression growing darker with each entry. This is a prosecutor's dream. Port Authority officials, customs inspectors, and half a dozen signatures from Senator Ashford authorizing shipments that should have been flagged, dates, dollar amounts, container numbers. She looked up. Why didn't you turn this over immediately? Because I wasn't sure what to do with it. Thomas had already committed crimes against me and 200 employees. The senator's corruption was secondary. I kept it as insurance in case Thomas tried something desperate. Margaret pulled out her phone and showed the photographs she'd taken of every page. I documented everything before I removed it. Timestamps, metadata, the works. Nothing was altered. David leaned forward. The question now is whether Thomas knows Margaret has it. He's about to find out. Victor opened his laptop and turned it so everyone could see. The DA is meeting with Thomas's attorneys in 40 minutes. They're expecting him to produce the ledger as his bargaining chip. When he can't, when he tells them about the safe deposit box, they're going to ask who else had access. And my name will come up. Margaret sat down suddenly, tired. They'll accuse me of obstruction. Not if we're proactive. Agent Chen closed the ledger carefully, already treating it like the evidence it was. I'll take this directly to the U.S. attorney. We'll say you discovered it during the normal course of reviewing joint assets during your divorce, secured it as potential evidence, and turned it over as soon as you learned of its relevance to an ongoing investigation, which is all technically true. Will they believe that? They'll want to. This ledger gives them Senator Ashford on a silver platter. They won't jeopardize that by going after you on technicalities. The agent's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, frowned. We have another problem. Ashford's chief of staff requested a meeting with the Justice Department this morning. Wants to discuss malicious false accusations against the senator. He's going on offense. Victor's jaw tightened. He's trying to get ahead of it, discredit the evidence before it becomes public. Then we go public first. Margaret heard herself say it before she'd fully thought it through. Release the ledger to the press. Let the court of public opinion force the Justice Department's hand. That's dangerous. David's voice was strained. Ashford has resources. If you make yourself his enemy, I'm already his enemy. The moment Thomas tried to bargain with information about him, Ashford started asking questions. He knows someone has evidence. Better he knows it's me and that it's already out there than wonder who's sitting on it. Agent Chen considered this, her fingers drumming on the table. If we coordinate with the U.S. Attorney's Office, leak it strategically through proper channels, it could work. Puts pressure on Ashford to cooperate rather than fight. It also puts a target on Margaret's back. David's hands were clenched into fists. What if Ashford decides the evidence is less dangerous than the witness? The room went silent. Margaret thought about her father pulling Victor from a burning car, never hesitating despite the danger. Bob Miller had taught her that doing the right thing sometimes meant taking risks. I didn't survive 20 years with Thomas Bailey just to hide from a corrupt senator. We released the evidence. Today. Victor made the calls. By noon, carefully selected journalists had received copies of key pages from the ledger, names redacted except Ashford's, but the pattern of corruption crystal clear. By 2 p.m., it was leading every news site. By 4, Senator Harold Ashford was holding an emergency press conference denying all allegations and promising lawsuits. Margaret watched it from Victor's office, David's hand warm on her shoulder. Ashford stood behind a podium bearing the Senate seal, looking every inch the statesman. Silver hair, perfectly styled, American flag pin on his lapel, expression radiating wounded dignity. These allegations are completely false and represent a coordinated attack by individuals seeking to distract from their own criminal behavior. Thomas Bailey is a convicted fraudster desperate to reduce his sentence. His ex-wife is a woman scorned, willing to fabricate evidence to damage anyone associated with her failed marriage. I have never in 30 years of public service accepted bribes or facilitated illegal activity. A reporter shouted a question. Senator, the ledger contains your signature on documents authorizing suspicious shipments. How do you explain that? I sign hundreds of documents a year in my capacity overseeing port operations. If some were fraudulent, I was deceived along with everyone else. I'm the victim here, not the perpetrator. What about the payments listed next to your name, amounts ranging from $50,000 to $200,000? Campaign contributions properly disclosed. Mr. Bailey's creative accounting doesn't change legal fundraising into bribes. Victor muted the television. He's good. I'll give him that. 30 years in politics teaches you how to lie smoothly. Will it work? Margaret's chest felt tight watching Ashford deflect and spin. Not once the FBI matches those signatures to his handwriting. Not once they trace those container numbers to actual shipments that never went through proper customs. He's buying time, hoping something will save him, but the evidence is too solid. Agent Chen called 20 minutes later. The U.S. Attorney wants to meet with you tomorrow. 9 a.m. Federal Building. They're moving forward with charges against Ashford, but they need your testimony about how you obtained the ledger and what you know about the safe deposit box. I'll be there. And Ms. Miller, thank you. Ashford's been untouchable for 3 decades. You just ended his career. Margaret hung up and stared at her reflection in Victor's office window. The woman looking back was 48 years old with gray in her hair and exhaustion carved into her face. But her eyes were clear, steady. She'd torn down 2 powerful men in 3 months, and she was still standing. I need to call my sons. She pulled out her phone. They're going to see this all over the news. I should tell them myself. Eric answered on the second ring. Mom, are you okay? The news is saying you exposed some senator. They're saying you might be in danger. I'm fine, sweetheart. I'm at Victor's office. I'm safe. This is because of Dad, isn't it? The senator was involved in his crimes. Yes, I found evidence and turned it over to the FBI. That's all. That's all, Mom. They're saying this could be the biggest political scandal in New York in 50 years. They're comparing it to Watergate. Eric's voice cracked. I'm scared. What if that senator tries to hurt you? He won't. The FBI is watching him too closely, and the best way to stay safe is to make sure everyone knows what I know. He can't silence me if the information is already public. You're braver than anyone I know. Eric sounded like he was crying. But I wish you didn't have to be. Me too, baby. Me too. Daniel didn't answer when she called. She left a voicemail. Danny, it's Mom. I know you're angry and I understand, but I wanted you to hear from me. I've provided evidence against Senator Ashford. It's going to be on the news. I'm safe. I'm doing the right thing, and I love you. Call me when you're ready. He didn't call back that night, or the next day, or the day after that. The meeting with the U.S. Attorney was everything Agent Chen had promised, thorough, professional, and clearly delighted to have such solid evidence. They took Margaret's statement about the safe deposit box, confirmed the chain of custody for the ledger, and assured her she'd done nothing wrong. In fact, Ms. Miller, you may have prevented destruction of evidence. If you hadn't secured that ledger when you did, there's every chance Mr. Bailey would have destroyed it once he realized he was under investigation. The attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Rodriguez, smiled. The Bureau is grateful. I just want justice for the employees Thomas stole from, for everyone Ashford's corruption hurt. You'll get it. We're filing charges against Ashford next week. Bribery, corruption, conspiracy to commit fraud. He's looking at 15 to 20 years if convicted. Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. And the pension fund. Can it be recovered? We're working on it. Asset forfeiture will reclaim what we can from Bailey's accounts. It won't be everything, but it'll be something. Better than the nothing those employees were facing. David was waiting outside the Federal Building when Margaret emerged. He pulled her into a hug that felt like coming home. How'd it go? They're charging Ashford, filing next week. So you just took down a CEO and a senator in the span of 4 months. What are you going to do for an encore? Margaret laughed, surprised she still could. Maybe rest for 5 minutes. I have a better idea. Come with me. He drove her to Brooklyn Bridge Park, where the Manhattan skyline stretched across the water in a glittering promise of 1,000 different futures. They walked along the waterfront, David's arm around her shoulders, comfortable silence settling between them. I've been thinking about what comes next. David stopped at a bench overlooking the river. After the trial, after everything settles, what do you want your life to look like? Margaret sat down, watching a ferry cut across the water. I want my sons to talk to me again. I want to rebuild something with them. And professionally, I don't know. I've been so focused on bringing Thomas down that I haven't thought about building anything up. She turned to look at him. What do you want? Honestly, I want to wake up next to you every morning. I want to take you to dinner at places nicer than this bench. I want to meet your sons when they're ready and be someone they can respect. I want to build a life that isn't defined by what we lost, but by what we're creating together. Margaret's throat tightened. After Thomas, she'd thought she was done with love, that whatever capacity she'd had for trust had been burned away. But David had shown her that love didn't have to mean sacrificing yourself. It could mean standing beside someone and being stronger together. I'd like that too. He kissed her there on the bench with the city as their witness, and for the first time in months, Margaret let herself believe in happy endings. The trial of United States versus Thomas Bailey began on the first Monday in February. The courthouse steps were packed with reporters and protesters. Someone had organized a group of Bailey Logistics employees to hold signs demanding justice for stolen pensions. Linda Reeves stood at the front, her voice carrying over the crowd. Thomas Bailey stole our futures. 20 years of savings gone so he could buy sports cars and throw parties. Margaret slipped past them through a side entrance, Victor and David flanking her like bodyguards. Inside, the marble halls echoed with footsteps and whispered conversations. Lawyers in expensive suits huddled in corners. Court officers checked IDs and directed traffic. Courtroom 318 was smaller than Margaret had expected from television. Wood paneling, fluorescent lights, rows of benches that looked uncomfortable. The jury box sat empty, waiting for the 12 citizens who would decide Thomas's fate. Thomas entered through a different door, flanked by U.S. Marshals. Prison had changed him in visible ways. He'd lost weight. His skin had gone sallow. His expensive suits had been replaced by an ill-fitting jacket his lawyer had probably bought off the rack. But his eyes still held that flash of arrogance when he spotted Margaret in the gallery. His lawyer, a defense attorney named Watkins, who charged $1,000 an hour, leaned over to whisper something. Thomas's expression shifted from arrogance to calculation. He was plotting something. Margaret could see it in the set of his jaw. The jury filed in 12 faces representing the full spectrum of New York. A black woman in her 60s who reminded Margaret of the church ladies from her childhood, a young Latino man in construction boots, a white businessman who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. They'd been screened for bias, tested for prejudice, and sworn to judge based solely on evidence. The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney James Morrison, was a veteran with 3 decades of white-collar prosecutions under his belt. He stood to deliver his opening statement with the confidence of someone who knew he held all the cards. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about betrayal. Thomas Bailey betrayed his wife, who built the very software that made his company successful. He betrayed his employees, stealing $12 million from their pension fund. He betrayed his shareholders by falsifying earnings reports. And he betrayed his country by laundering $40 million for organized crime. Morrison walked to a screen and pulled up the first exhibit, a photograph of Margaret from 1998, 8 months pregnant, sitting at a computer. This is Margaret Miller, then Margaret Bailey, writing code for her husband's startup. She worked overnight while he slept. She debugged systems while raising their children. She built the infrastructure that made Bailey Logistics worth $400 million. Next slide. Thomas at a Forbes photo shoot standing in front of the New York skyline. This is Thomas Bailey taking sole credit for that success, telling investors he was a visionary, accepting awards for innovation, getting rich off his wife's brilliance while calling her dead weight. Margaret watched the jury's faces shift from neutral to sympathetic. Morrison was good at this. The evidence will show that Thomas Bailey systematically stole from the people who trusted him, that he created shell companies in Delaware and Nevada to hide assets during his divorce, that he moved pension funds into his personal accounts to cover gambling debts in Atlantic City, that he falsified shipping manifests to launder money for Frank Moretti, a known associate of Boston organized crime. Morrison paused, letting that sink in. And when his wife discovered these crimes through the audit trail she'd built into her own code, Thomas Bailey tried to destroy her. He offered her $5,000 a month, barely enough to rent a studio apartment after 20 years of marriage. He threw a party to celebrate divorcing her. He told 300 people she was boring and beige and worthless. The prosecutor's voice hardened. But Margaret Miller isn't worthless. She's the reason we're here today, because she documented everything, because she had the courage to come forward, because she refused to let powerful men escape consequences. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. David squeezed her hand. The defense will try to paint this as a vindictive ex-wife fabricating evidence. They'll claim the audit trail was a hack, that the documents were altered, that Margaret Miller is lying to get revenge. But the evidence speaks for itself. Bank records, email servers, testimony from Marcus Green, the CFO who helped Thomas cook the books, shipping manifests with forged signatures. Every piece of evidence points to one inescapable conclusion: Thomas Bailey is guilty. Watkins stood for his opening statement. He was everything Morrison wasn't: slick where Morrison was solid, theatrical where Morrison was straightforward. My client is an innocent man being destroyed by a bitter divorce. Margaret Miller isn't a hero. She's a hacker who illegally accessed confidential business records to manufacture a case against her ex-husband. She planted a so-called audit trail in code she wrote 20 years ago, code she had complete control over, and now claims it proves crimes she herself may have invented. Margaret's hands clenched. Victor leaned over and whispered, "Breathe. This is just posturing. The evidence will destroy him. Think about it." Watkins paced in front of the jury box. Mrs. Miller had total access to Bailey Logistics systems. She could create any transaction record she wanted. She could fabricate emails. She could make it look like money moved when it didn't. And why? Because Thomas Bailey had the audacity to leave her for a younger woman, because he hurt her pride. So she decided to hurt him back by inventing a criminal empire that never existed. He pointed at Thomas, who had arranged his face into an expression of wounded innocence. My client is a successful businessman who built a logistics company from nothing. Yes, he made mistakes in his personal life. Yes, his marriage failed. But that doesn't make him a criminal. That makes him human. The jury looked less convinced now. Some were watching Thomas with open skepticism. The businessman in the front row had his arms crossed, his expression suggesting he'd seen this exact act before. The prosecution wants you to believe that Thomas Bailey somehow masterminded a 15-year fraud scheme while simultaneously running a $400 million company, that he personally created shell companies, falsified hundreds of documents, and laundered millions, all without any of the sophisticated financial controls or accounting oversight that every legitimate business maintains. Does that sound plausible to you? Watkins smiled like he'd made an excellent point. Or is it more likely that a brilliant programmer with complete system access fabricated evidence to destroy the man who divorced her? The prosecution spent 3 weeks building its case brick by methodical brick. Marcus Green testified first, looking 20 years older than he had at the Plaza party. His hands shook as he described how Thomas had pressured him into cooking the books. He said if I didn't help him, he'd blacklist me from every finance position in New York. I have 3 kids. I couldn't afford to lose my job. Marcus's voice cracked. I know I should have refused. I know I'm guilty too. But I was scared. The prosecutor pulled up an email on the screen. Is this your correspondence with Thomas Bailey? Marcus read it, his face going pale. Yes, that's where he told me to move the pension funds into the Delaware LLC. I tried to argue, said it was illegal. He said it was temporary, that he'd pay it back. Did he pay it back? No. An FBI forensic accountant testified next, walking the jury through spreadsheets that showed money flowing from employee pensions into Thomas's shell companies, then into his personal accounts. Every transaction was documented, time-stamped, traceable. The pattern is consistent with deliberate embezzlement, not accounting errors. The amounts were carefully calculated to avoid triggering automatic fraud alerts. The timing coincided with periods when Mr. Bailey had gambling debts or large personal expenses. This was systematic theft over 15 years. David took the stand in the third week, explaining how he'd analyzed Margaret's evidence and verified its authenticity. Every transaction in the shadow database matched perfectly with bank records, shipping manifests, and third-party documentation. If Mrs. Miller had fabricated this data, she would have needed access to dozens of financial institutions, shipping companies, and government agencies. The idea that she single-handedly created a fake paper trail this extensive and consistent is technically impossible. Watkins tried to shake him on cross-examination. "But you're dating Mrs. Miller, aren't you, Mr. Green? Doesn't that create a bias?" "I'm dating her because I admire her integrity, not the other way around." "How convenient." The forensic accountant falls in love with his star witness. "Tell me, Mr. Green, did your personal feelings influence your analysis?" David's voice stayed level. "My analysis is based on objective financial data that anyone with forensic accounting training could verify. My personal feelings for Margaret Miller don't change mathematics." Then came the testimony everyone had been waiting for. The prosecution called Margaret Miller to the stand. She walked to the witness box on legs that felt disconnected from her body. The court officer swore her in his voice a distant buzz. She placed her hand on the Bible and promised to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, as if there was any other option at this point. Morrison approached with a gentle expression. "Ms. Miller, can you tell the jury about your role in founding Bailey Logistics?" So she did. She told them about being a junior programmer in 1998, about meeting Thomas when he was a startup founder with big ideas and no technical skills, about writing code while pregnant, about building the logistics tracking system that became the company's foundation. "I built it to last. I used best practices, included audit trails, created redundancy. That's what good programmers do. We plan for every contingency." "Including the contingency that your husband might commit fraud?" "No. The audit trail was standard practice, not a trap. I never imagined I'd need it like this." Morrison pulled up the shadow database on the courtroom screens. "Can you explain what we're seeing?" "Every transaction processed through Bailey Logistics is recorded twice. Once in the main database that Thomas and his team could see, once in a backup system only I could access. It's automatic. The code creates both records simultaneously." "Why couldn't Thomas access the backup?" "Because I wrote the original code with administrative privileges that only I had. It was my failsafe in case the main system crashed. Thomas never bothered to learn how the code worked. He just used it." "When did you first notice irregularities in the transaction records?" Margaret took a breath. This was the part that would make or break her credibility. "About 10 years ago. I saw money moving in ways that didn't make sense. Amounts that should have gone to employee pensions redirecting to accounts I didn't recognize. But I didn't want to believe Thomas would steal. I told myself I was misunderstanding." "When did you start actively investigating?" "When he asked for a divorce. He offered me $5,000 a month after 20 years of marriage. That's when I realized he'd been hiding assets. So I started looking at everything." Morrison took her through it all, the shell companies, the pension fund theft, the money laundering. Margaret explained each transaction in clear technical terms. She showed the jury how to read the shipping manifests, how to trace the Delaware LLCs back to Thomas, how the timing of the transactions coincided with his personal expenses. She was steady through all of it, even when Morrison asked about Thomas calling her beige, even when he made her describe finding out about Ashley Vaughn, even when he showed the jury the torn check, the $10,000 Thomas had thought would buy her silence. Then Watkins stood up for cross-examination, and the real battle began. "Ms. Miller, you claim you didn't know about your husband's alleged crimes for 10 years. But you're a brilliant programmer by your own admission. Are you really asking this jury to believe you couldn't see what was happening in your own code?" "I saw irregularities. I didn't want to believe they meant what they did." "Or you saw nothing wrong because there was nothing wrong until you decided to fabricate evidence to hurt the man who left you." "I didn't fabricate anything." "But you could have. You had complete system access. You wrote the original code. You could create any transaction record you wanted and backdate it to look historical." "Except I didn't. Every transaction I flagged can be verified against external bank records, shipping manifests, third-party documentation. If I fabricated them, how did I also fabricate matching records in dozens of other systems I had no access to?" Watkins smiled like she'd walked into a trap. "Perhaps you had help. Perhaps Mr. Green, your boyfriend, helped you create this elaborate fiction." "David didn't analyze my evidence until months after I'd documented everything, and his analysis was verified by the FBI's own forensic accountants. Multiple independent experts have confirmed the data is authentic. Or they confirmed you're all very good at fraud yourselves." Morrison objected. The judge sustained. But the damage was done. Watkins had planted doubt. "Let's talk about the safe deposit box. You removed a ledger that belonged to your husband. Isn't that theft?" "The box was jointly owned. I had equal legal access." "But you knew that ledger was evidence of crimes. You knew the FBI would want it, yet you kept it for weeks. Why?" Margaret met his eyes. "Because I wasn't sure what to do with it. The ledger implicated a sitting U.S. senator. That's not something you hand over lightly. I needed to be certain it was real, that it would be taken seriously, that turning it in wouldn't just get it buried. So you took it upon yourself to be judge and jury, to decide when and how to expose this evidence." "I took it upon myself to protect evidence I knew Thomas would destroy." "Or you took it to create leverage, to use against your husband or anyone else you wanted to hurt." "I turned it over to the FBI as soon as I learned Thomas was trying to use it as a bargaining chip. I didn't leverage it. I secured it." Watkins walked to the defense table and picked up a photograph. "Do you recognize this woman?" Margaret looked at the image. It was her from 1998, visibly pregnant, smiling at whoever was holding the camera. She looked so young, so naive. "That's me." "You were happy then, in love with your husband, building a life together." "Yes." "What happened to that woman, Ms. Miller? When did she become someone willing to destroy the father of her children?" Margaret felt something crack open in her chest. That woman learned that love without honesty is just a prettier word for being used. That building someone up doesn't mean they won't tear you down. That staying silent in the face of wrongdoing doesn't make you loyal, it makes you complicit. She looked at Thomas directly for the first time since taking the stand. He stared back, unreadable. "Thomas didn't just betray me. He betrayed 200 employees who trusted him. He stole their futures so he could gamble in Atlantic City. He laundered money for criminals. He committed fraud on a massive scale. I didn't destroy him. I documented what he'd already done to himself." Watkins opened his mouth to respond, but Margaret wasn't finished. "You want to know when I stopped being that happy pregnant woman in the photograph? The day I realized the man I loved was a lie. The day I understood that every success he claimed was built on my work and other people's trust. The day I chose to stand up instead of stay silent. I'm not the villain in this story, Mr. Watkins. I'm just the one who finally turned on the lights." The courtroom was silent. The jury looked at her with expressions ranging from sympathy to respect. Even the businessman in the front row had uncrossed his arms. Watkins cleared his throat. "No further questions." Margaret stepped down from the witness stand on shaking legs. She'd done it. She'd told her story. Whatever happened next was up to 12 strangers and the weight of evidence that couldn't be denied. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Margaret spent that time in a hotel room Victor had arranged, unable to bear going back to her studio apartment where she'd just sit and wait. David stayed with her, ordering room service they barely touched, watching mindless television neither of them saw. On the afternoon of the second day, her phone rang. "Victor, they have a verdict. Get to the courthouse." The courtroom was packed when Margaret arrived. Every seat filled, people standing in the back, reporters lining the walls. Thomas sat at the defense table, looking smaller than she remembered, his lawyer whispering urgent last-minute instructions. The jury filed in. None of them looked at Thomas. That was a bad sign for him, David had explained. Juries that convicted couldn't meet the defendant's eyes. The foreman stood, a middle-aged woman with gray hair and steady hands. The judge asked if they'd reached a verdict. "We have, Your Honor." "On the count of wire fraud, how do you find guilty?" Thomas's face went white. "On the count of securities fraud, how do you find you guilty?" His lawyer put a hand on his shoulder, probably warning him to stay seated, to show no reaction. "On the count of money laundering, how do you find guilty?" 24 counts. 24 guilties. By the end, Thomas was staring at the table, his jaw clenched so tight Margaret could see the muscle jumping. The judge set sentencing for 6 weeks out. Thomas was remanded to custody pending that hearing. The marshals moved toward him with handcuffs, and suddenly he twisted away his eyes, finding Margaret in the gallery. "This is your fault," his voice cracked. "You destroyed me. You destroyed our family. I hope you're happy." The marshals restrained him, but he kept shouting as they dragged him toward the door. "I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me, you vindictive—" The door closed, cutting off whatever he'd been about to call her. Margaret sat very still, feeling nothing and everything at once. Victor was shaking her hand. David was pulling her into a hug. People were congratulating her. But all she could think about was Daniel, who still wasn't answering her calls. Eric, who was trying so hard to hold their fractured family together. The life she'd had 20 years ago, when she'd been young and stupid enough to believe love conquered all. Outside the courthouse, Linda Reeves was waiting with 20 other Bailey Logistics employees. When Margaret emerged, they applauded. Linda pulled her into a fierce embrace. "You did it. You got us justice. The pension fund recovery isn't finalized yet. You might not get everything back. We'll get something. That's more than we had before you fought for us." Linda stepped back, her eyes shining. "You're a hero, Maggie, whether you feel like one or not." Margaret went home to her studio apartment alone that night. David had wanted to stay, but she needed space to process what had happened. She sat on her air mattress and stared at her phone, debating whether to try calling Daniel again. Before she could decide, the phone rang. Daniel's number. Her hands shook as she answered. "Danny, I watched the verdict on the news." Her son's voice was quiet, drained of the anger that had defined their last conversation. "I saw Dad being dragged out screaming at you. I'm sorry you had to see that. I'm sorry I didn't believe you. When you first told me about the crimes, I thought you were exaggerating, making him sound worse than he was because you were hurt about the divorce." Daniel took a shaky breath. "But it was all true, everything you said. He really did steal from those people. He really is a criminal." "Yes. I've been such an asshole to you. You were trying to do the right thing, and I acted like you were the bad guy. You were trying to protect your father. There's nothing wrong with that." "There is when your father is Thomas Bailey." Daniel laughed, but it sounded broken. "God, Mom, how did you survive 20 years married to him?" "One day at a time, same way I'm surviving now." "Can I come see you? I don't want to do this over the phone anymore. I want to come home." Margaret closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, please, come home." Sentencing day arrived with unseasonable warmth for March. Margaret wore a navy suit David had helped her pick out, professional but not flashy, expensive enough to show she'd rebuilt her life, but not so expensive it looked like she was celebrating. The courtroom was quieter this time. No media circus, no protesters, just the judge and the lawyers and the family members who had stake in the outcome. Eric sat beside Margaret, holding her hand. Daniel was on her other side, his presence still new enough that she kept glancing over to make sure he was real. Thomas was brought in looking like he'd aged a decade in 6 weeks. Prison orange had replaced his suits. His hair needed cutting. His eyes were hollow. Judge Patterson, a black woman in her 60s with a reputation for toughness tempered by fairness, reviewed the sentencing guidelines with care. Mr. Bailey, you have been convicted of 24 counts of fraud, money laundering, and embezzlement. The prosecution has recommended 30 years. The defense has asked for leniency, citing your lack of prior criminal history and your contributions to New York's business community. She paused, looking at Thomas over her reading glasses. I've presided over white-collar cases for 20 years. I've seen brilliant people make terrible choices, but I've never seen someone display the level of arrogance and entitlement you've shown throughout this process. You stole from employees who trusted you. You defrauded shareholders who invested in your company. You helped criminals launder money through American ports. And when confronted with your crimes, you blamed your ex-wife, the woman who built your empire, and threw a party to celebrate divorcing her. Thomas's lawyer whispered something to him. Thomas shook his head, stubborn even now. The court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for at least 20 years. You will also pay restitution to the victims of your fraud in an amount to be determined by the asset forfeiture proceedings. 25 years. Thomas was 52. He'd be 77 when he got out if he survived that long. The marshals moved to take him away. Thomas stood, and for a moment Margaret thought he might shout at her again. But instead he just looked at his sons, at Daniel and Eric sitting beside the woman he'd tried to destroy. I'm sorry. His voice was barely audible. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Then he was gone, led back to whatever cell awaited him. Eric leaned against Margaret's shoulder. Is it over now? Not completely. Senator Ashford's trial starts next month. But the hard part, yeah, it's over. What happens next? Margaret thought about the job offer she'd received last week, CTO position at a growing tech company, double what Thomas had paid her as a junior programmer 24 years ago. She thought about David's suggestion that she move in with him, start fresh in a place that wasn't haunted by memories. She thought about Daniel's plans to transfer to NYU so he could be closer to home, and Eric's college applications listing her studio apartment as his permanent address. Next, we rebuild. We figure out what our family looks like now. We move forward. Together. Eric's voice was small. Together. 6 months later, Margaret stood in the office of Architect Logistics, the company she'd founded from the ashes of Bailey's empire. The federal asset forfeiture process had seized Bailey Logistics and its assets. Margaret had led a group of employees in buying it through bankruptcy court for a fraction of its former value. They'd renamed it, restructured it, and built it back based on the original code she'd written in 1998. The view from her office showed the Manhattan skyline stretching endlessly in both directions. Linda Reeves, now VP of Operations, knocked on the open door. The pension fund recovery came through, full amount plus interest. Every employee who lost money is getting it back. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. All of it. Every penny. The federal prosecutors did good work on asset forfeiture. Between Thomas's shell companies and Senator Ashford's seized accounts, they recovered everything and then some. Linda crossed the office and hugged her. You did this. You saved us. We did this. All of us together. After Linda left, Margaret sat at her desk and pulled out the photograph Daniel had given her last week. It showed the four of them, Margaret, David, Daniel, and Eric, at Eric's high school graduation. They were all smiling, genuinely happy, in a way that didn't require hiding or pretending or making themselves smaller. Her phone buzzed. A text from David, "Dinner tonight, that place you like in Brooklyn." She texted back, "Perfect, I love you." His response came immediately, "Love you too, see you at 7." Margaret looked around her office, her legitimate office in her own company built on her own merit. The walls were decorated with photos of her team, not awards and ego-stroking magazine covers. The desk held work she cared about, not someone else's stolen glory. She'd started this journey as a woman being discarded, dead weight, beige, boring. She'd ended it as an architect, a CEO, a mother who'd shown her sons that standing up to power mattered more than keeping the peace, a woman who'd turned silence into strategy and patience into power. Thomas Bailey had called it a celebration of new beginnings. He'd been right about that at least, just not in any way he could have imagined. The demolition was complete, the construction was ongoing, and the foundation she'd built herself, brick by careful brick, was solid as stone.